Mystical Journey, The Incredible Life of George Hunt Williamson. Welcome to this brief introduction. My name is Michel Zirger. I am French. I am the co-author of the book Mystical Journey, The Incredible Life of George Hunt Williamson, which I wrote in association with my Italian friend Maurizio Martinelli. Today I would like to speak to you about one of the very first so-called contactees, someone who was also privileged to be a witness to the historic first encounter with an extraterrestrial on November 20th, 1952, near Desert Center in California. A person often identified as the father of what is commonly called the ancient astronaut theory. I would like to speak to you about George Hunt Williamson. The name of George Hunt Williamson first burst into my life when I read the book written by Desmond Leslie and George Adamski, Flying Saucers Have Landed. It is a classic, a bestseller that all of you know of, which came out in 1953. Of course, I did not read it in 1953. I was not yet born. I read it in 1972, which sort of dates me. And from that moment on, Flying Saucers Have Landed became my bedside book, and I am not ashamed to say that it is still so. Even today, I browse through it, or consult it, should I say, rather regularly. Why? Because I find that this book is a very intelligently written and prophetic digest of all that, even today, revolves around the UFO phenomenon. I used to say that this book is a true magic cauldron of ufology. In short, it was therefore a result of this reading that I became interested in George Hunt Williamson, or rather in Dr. Williamson, as he is usually called in Flying Saucers Have Landed. In consequence of that reading, the name of George Hunt Williamson remained literally imprinted in my mind and has not left me since. Was it due to some mysterious and transcendent reason? I don't know. Or was it due to a more prosaic reason? For indeed, in his account forming the second part of Flying Saucers Have Landed, George Adamski gave us nothing, so to speak, about this Dr. Williamson, except these three pieces of information. Namely, that he lived in Prescott, Arizona, that he was an anthropologist, and that he had served during the Second World War in the U.S. Air Force. That's it. But, you will tell me, this lack of information was not surprising, as George Hunt Williamson was only 25 years old at the time of the events reported in Flying Saucers Have Landed, and that he had not written, or in any case published, any books. He became a writer only afterwards, after the events of Desert Center. Anyway, the fact remains that this lack of information certainly aroused my curiosity, and little by little over the years, I wanted to know more about this mysterious Dr. Williamson. I thus undertook research, and as this research progressed, his character became more and more complex, very far from the image of the young Williamson which one could have by just reading Flying Saucers Have Landed. To my great surprise, I discovered that he was the author of several books, which was, of course, not mentioned in George Adamski's account. Well, I'm not going to detail here the very long journey of my research, but just to say that about 15 years ago, I had the opportunity to acquire a part of the personal archives of George Hunt Williamson after his death. That is, many letters, the manuscripts of his main books, unpublished manuscripts, notebooks, his personal diary, etc. And following this acquisition, and due also, I have to say, to some personal experiences of contact which occurred in my life, but about which I shall not speak today, I decided to focus on the figure of George Hunt Williamson. And the first result of this research are now in this book, Mystical Journey, The Incredible Life of George Hunt Williamson. The results are based for the most part on the personal documents having belonged to Williamson, which are in my ownership today. I'm anxious to emphasize that this is a world premiere, since it is the very first book of this scale dedicated completely to George Hunt Williamson. I would now like for you to look at these first three photos. As you've guessed, it is of course Williamson in three periods of his life. The first photo is from 1948, with a beautiful mustache. The second, from 1957, and the third one taken in 1975. As you will notice, there are quite a lot of changes. We often say that during the same life, it is possible to live several lives. If I take my case, for example, I can say without hesitation that I have already lived two very distinct lives, the one that I had in France, and the one that I have been having for more than 20 years in Japan. I arrived in Japan in February of 1994. Two very different lives. George Hunt Williamson, never one to follow the herd, had three lives, three totally distinct lives represented through these three photos. So today, I would like to do a rapid overview of the three lives of George Hunt Williamson, which will at least allow you to have some definitive reference points about one of the most poorly known players in the ufological scene. His three lives can be very clearly dated. The first one from 1926, the year of his birth, to the end of November 1952, that is, until the events at Desert Center, which are related in Flying Saucers Have Landed. His second life from December 1952 to 1961, and the last one from 1962 to 1986, the year of his death. He was born in Chicago, Illinois. Here's the page of the family book of the Williamsons recording the birth of George Leonard Williamson, Jr., George Hunt Williamson. I underline again that most of the documents I present here are unique documents having belonged to George Hunt Williamson, original documents which I was able to acquire in the course of my research. Williamson was an only son. He came from a relatively well-to-do family, shall we say, without any particular financial problems. Apparently, he had a childhood without any problems, completely normal, without trauma. Here is George Hunt Williamson in 1945 in Chicago. He is 18 years old. This photo is taken from the 1945 yearbook of his university. His parents moved in July 1947 to settle far from Chicago. They went west to Arizona to the city of Prescott. Williamson studied first at Eastern New Mexico University in Portales, New Mexico, the state which adjoins Arizona. Then from 1949 he went to continue his studies of anthropology at the University of Arizona in Tucson. On September 1st, 1949, he married Betty Jane Hetler, who therefore became Betty Jane Williamson. They were both 22 years old and had met at Eastern New Mexico University in 1947. Here's a photo of Betty. This photo is from 1948, 1 year before the marriage. Photos of Betty are particularly rare. Personally, I know of only three. At the university, the personality of Williamson becomes more of a rebel, shall we say. The purely academic teaching of the anthropology, the archaeology, did not really seem to correspond any longer to what he was looking for. It began to leave him a bit cold. He asked himself questions. He did not call into question the quality of his professors, but began to find all this teaching slightly dated, narrow-minded, and ultimately derisory. He was already in search of something else. He was thirsty for something else. Here's a photo of an Indian dance. But why a photo of an Indian dance, you might ask? It's because what fascinated Williamson more than anything was the Indian tribes, in particular the Hopi Indians, but also the Apache, the Papago, the Navajo, and the Sioux. He had, moreover, from his adolescence onwards, some very good Indian friends. And this photo is here to illustrate what is generally ignored, that Williamson at that time was a great dancer of Indian ritual dances. He participated regularly as a dancer in what is called a powwow, that is, a gathering, a festival, with performances or ceremonies of Indian ritual dancing. The Indians themselves really admired this dancer's natural qualities. He even won several competitions of dances against seasoned Indian dancers, once even outclassing the best Sioux dancers. As a consequence of his passion for the Indians, in 1951, at 24 years old, an opportunity arose. He seized it. He left Arizona to go and live in an Indian tribe in the north of the United States, the Chippewa tribe of Minnesota. It was for him an excellent opportunity to break with university routine and to lead anthropological works in the real world. This experience lasted from July 1951 to May 1952, nearly a full year. He lived with an Indian family, totally immersed with Indians, and he wrote a sort of memoir which I was able to acquire, entitled simply Chippewa Diary. Here is the unpublished manuscript of Chippewa Diary in my ownership. And here are some Chippewa Indians. The first days of his arrival among the Chippewa, it was raining so much that he could not go out. He took advantage of this to read a book which he had bought at a bus stop on the way, somewhat by chance. Major Donald Kehoe's book, Flying Saucers Are Real. It was one of the first books on the flying saucers. This book interests him excessively, and he reads it in one breath. Here's the front cover of Donald A. Kehoe's book. It is a pocketbook. As a result of the reading of this book, Williamson began to draw links between the accounts of flying saucer sightings found in Kehoe's book and certain legends he had collected himself directly from Indians. I have to indicate also that from this period among the Chippewa, he was in search of certain mystical or initiatory experiences in connection with the Indian shamans, their so-called medicine men. While among the Chippewa, he had at least one very striking mystical experience, complete with visions. In any case, his mysticism developed unmistakably around that time. Then came August 1952, and his life then knew its first big jolt, because in that month, seemingly by chance, he found himself involved as a witness, but also as protagonist, in a long series of radio contacts with various extraterrestrial entities. These extraterrestrials, it seems, sent their messages either from their ships or directly from their planet. They said they originated from planets of our solar system, but also from other planetary systems in our galaxy, and even from a system outside of our galaxy. Indeed, Williamson and his friends affirmed having received messages from the planet Haton, supposedly situated in the galaxy of Andromeda, which is the galaxy closest to ours, Milky Way. These messages were received thanks to the shortwave radio equipment of a ham operator named Lyman Streeter. The communications were made by radio telegraphy, that is, by using Morse code. A single communication was made by direct voice, the only time when they were able to hear the actual voice of one of their interlocutors. These contacts evolved later on towards a form of telepathy that is called voice channeling. This first experience of extraterrestrial contact marked him so profoundly that he referred to it until the end of his life. For him, the contacts had been real. There was no doubt about it. The bulk of these extraterrestrial radio messages came to an end on November 1st, 1952, thus before he met George Adamski. There were, however, some further messages received in February 1953. Then, of course, came the meeting of Williamson with George Adamski. They met only once, for a couple of days at most, at the beginning of November 1952. In fact, George Adamski was already somewhat known at that time, thanks to an article published in 1951 in the magazine Fate, and to a series of UFO photos that appeared in 1952 in Kenneth Arnold's book, The Coming of the Saucers. Williamson decided to visit Adamski at his home on the slopes of Mount Palomar, California. He went there mostly to have Adamski's opinion on the radio contacts he and his friends had just received. Let us recall that at the time, Adamski had had no contacts yet, but he was only known for UFO photos taken through his telescope, generally objects passing in front of the moon. Then, inevitably, of course, came the events of November 20th, 1952. I suppose that everybody knows what happened on that November 20th, 1952 near Desert Center. Well, we're going to illustrate this historic event rather rapidly with some photos. But first of all, I would like to read you what Williamson himself used to state during lectures or radio interviews whenever he discussed the November 20th, 1952 contact. At the same time, this will give you a quick overview of the events. This is what Williamson used to say. I would like to reaffirm here that the experience, as George Adamski has related in Flying Saucers Have Landed, where my wife and I, along with our friends, witnessed to the occurrence, happened exactly as Mr. Adamski mentions there in Flying Saucers Have Landed. The large craft was witnessed, and then through binoculars we did witness the other happenings about a mile away in the desert. We did see the small ship as it hovered in the saddle, the base of the small hills where Adamski was standing. We did see Mr. Adamski talking to someone. We did see him talking to someone at a distance, that someone naturally being the extraterrestrial visitor later named Orthon by George Adamski. We saw the large craft. We saw flashes of light from it, from which we later learned the smaller craft had come out of the larger one. We did see a great opening in the bigger craft through which the smaller scout ship must have originally left the larger ship. And I'd like to add also that my wife and I both signed legal affidavits, which are reproduced in Flying Saucers Have Landed, and that we both read the manuscript of Adamski's account before it was sent to the publisher. Here is a photo of Desert Center showing the exact place where the encounter between George Adamski and the extraterrestrial, later named Orthon, happened. A painting of Orthon's face by an artist done at my direction. Here's the same Orthon, but drawn by me. Here you can see the group of witnesses of the contact of November 20th, 1952, surrounding the footprints of Orthon. On the right, Williamson is doing plaster casts of the visitors' footprints. Here is the photo of the right shoe imprint. Here is an unpublished hand drawing by George Hunt Williamson of this right shoe imprint. It is from the original Other Tongues, Other Flesh manuscript by Williamson in my ownership. Here is the interpretation of the symbols contained in the right footprint. The group of 4 of the witnesses is at the Phoenix Gazette newspaper in this photo. What we can say with an absolute certainty is that the events of that November 20th, 1952 completely changed the life of Williamson. He abandoned his university studies, and from then on he began his second life. Four things characterize this second life: the explorations of Peru, the lecture tours, the editing of a small ufological magazine, but mostly the writing of 6 books, which I think remain must-reads for anyone passionate about ufology or esotericism. He writes his first book, The Saucers Speak, in 1953, just after the events of Desert Center. This book tells in detail about the radio contacts of 1952 we have already mentioned. Here is the front cover of the original American edition of The Saucers Speak. Let us note that this is obviously a world premiere, since it is the first time that a book is dedicated to radio messages of a potentially extraterrestrial source. The book came out in February 1954. In that same year of 1954, he finalized an extremely important second book entitled Other Tongues, Other Flesh. Here is the original manuscript ribbon copy of Other Tongues, Other Flesh, photographed together with the original American edition of the book. It happens that I was able to acquire the original manuscript ribbon copies of his main books, among which was that of Other Tongues, Other Flesh. These manuscripts were typed by Williamson on his trusty and long-lived manual typewriter, with many handwritten corrections and additions in the text. Other Tongues, Other Flesh is very, very important, because in this book are published for the first time some of the photos which were taken on November 20th, 1952, during the events at Desert Center with George Adamski. In particular, the photos of the shoe imprints of the extraterrestrial Orthon containing symbolic messages. We find, moreover, in this book an exhaustive interpretation of these symbolic messages. We find in it also the very first classification of various types of extraterrestrials. And we find, more than 10 years before Erich von Däniken, the foundations of the theory of the ancient astronauts. In other words, Williamson developed well before von Däniken the idea that extraterrestrials were able to intervene on Earth in the past, particularly in biblical times. In short, a key book concerning the extraterrestrial contacts, even a seminal book if we consider the number of new and original concepts we can find in it, as for example the theme of the Wanderers, who are supposedly, according to Williamson, extraterrestrials who voluntarily reincarnate on Earth. It must be noted that, although completed in 1954, Other Tongues, Other Flesh was not released before September 1956. There will subsequently be other books that were just as important. In 1958, it was Secret Places of the Lion. Here is the original British edition of Secret Places of the Lion, accompanied here with the original manuscript ribbon copy I was able to acquire. Here are various editions of Secret Places of the Lion. This book developed the theme of the successive reincarnations of certain extraterrestrial entities on our planet. These extraterrestrials initially came from the star system of Sirius. They are the Wanderers, already discussed in Other Tongues, Other Flesh. Even there, Williamson deals brilliantly with this complicated subject and proposes an original and groundbreaking vision of reincarnation, breaking with what was being written at the time. Here is the front cover of the original American edition of UFOs Confidential. In 1958, there was also UFOs Confidential. The book is divided into two equal parts. The first one is by Williamson, and the second by his most loyal follower, John McCoy, who also later worked with him in Peru. This book touches upon the theme of the world cover-up conspiracy and is very certainly one of the first books of the UFO conspiracy genre. The year 1959 was marked by the release of Road in the Sky. Here is the original manuscript of Road in the Sky. Here's the front cover of the original British edition of Road in the Sky. Road in the Sky returned to the theory of the ancient astronauts with, for example, and this was a first, a whole chapter dedicated to the lines of Nazca, illustrated with many photos. Williamson talks about how the petroglyphs of Pizarro in Peru, the sculptures of Marcahuasi, of course, also in Peru, the legends of the Hopi Indians, and many other topics, an array of topics which no one had ever dealt with before. Something which makes this book a must-read for every person interested in the theme of the ancient astronauts, or ancient aliens, as we say today. And this, I repeat, was 10 years before Erich von Däniken. And the sixth and last published work, Secret of the Andes, in 1961, attributed on the cover to Brother Philip. Here's the front cover of the original British edition of Secret of the Andes. Again, a pioneering book which resembled no other of that period, a book which I would say is special, much more mystical than the previous ones, and which appeared to mark a real break and an evolution towards something else. Unfortunately, after this book, there was to be nothing more. 1961 was indeed the year when Williamson changed his identity and became, in the registry office, Michel Zirger. But we're going to come back to that. As far as UFOs Confidential and Secret of the Andes are concerned, there are no known manuscripts. They have remained untraceable until now. I do not know if they were destroyed, but in any event, they have not been located, and therefore I was not able to acquire them. What I would like to underline here is that each of these books by Williamson is often a kind of development or analysis of themes that we can find in the series of radio contacts of 1952. Whether it be the ancient swastika symbol, the planet Maldek, the tribunal of Saturn, Saros, which is the so-called name given to the Earth by the extraterrestrials, the concept of the Wanderers, the extraterrestrial language called the Solex Mal, etc. Almost everything was already announced in the radio messages received from August 1952, and these messages even announced a future landing with contact for September 28, 1952, a contact which was not able to take place, which was simply missed, as a matter of fact. Should we imagine that those same extraterrestrials gave them a second chance 2 months later, on November 20th, 1952, at Desert Center? The 6 books by Williamson are thus the analytical expansion, so to speak, of the radio messages of 1952. It is really the main thread of the work of Williamson. And the other point that I would like to highlight is that each of these books is an original work, creating every time a new genre. They are, without doubt, 6 books which can be described as innovative. Many concepts which are developed in them were to be later adopted into the vocabulary of other contactees. I'm thinking in particular of the American contactee, Orfeo Angelucci, the famous Omnek Onek, the Italian contactee, Eugenio Siragusa, the English contactee George King, and also, although he is probably not conscious of it, the current French contactee, Serge Riviere-Nazaire. But until the present day, people from other horizons have been inspired by them, drawing from them certain concepts, as Steven Spielberg and George Lucas did in Star Wars and Indiana Jones, and of course, Erich von Däniken in his books. However, in this second life, we can point out a first period that was a little more ufological, during which he published until the end of 1956 a small quarterly publication, the Telonic Research Bulletin. Here's the cover of one of the issues of the Telonic Research Bulletin. In this news bulletin, he suggests, to begin with, setting up the first network of UFO detection in the territory of the United States, with observers who would be linked by ham radio. The main objective? To spot UFOs and try to enter into communication by means of shortwave radio or other devices, as this one in the photo. Here we can see George Hunt Williamson with a device of that time used to try to communicate with the UFOs. This device, called Modulated Light Beam Receiver, was supposed to be able to translate into sounds certain coded luminous impulses coming from UFOs. Here is the team of the Telonic Research Center in Prescott, Arizona. George Hunt Williamson, left, and his wife Betty Jane, seated in front of the tape recorder, and at the microphone, an associate, Michael Fitzpatrick. But of course, what we know most of this second life is his stay and his exploration of Peru from December 1956. A real break, because he and his wife, Betty, moved with their 3.5-year-old son to go and settle down in Peru. Of this period we know, of course, his search for the famous monastery of the Brotherhood of Seven Rays, which was at the center of his last book, Secret of the Andes. A book which tells, among other things, the story of the group led by Williamson on the trail of this monastery of the Seven Rays and legendary lost cities at the heart of the Amazon jungle. In a chapter of my book, Mystical Journeys, The Incredible Life of George Hunt Williamson, I explain in detail the reasons why Williamson resorted to using the pseudonym of Brother Philip for his last work. George Hunt Williamson is seen here at Machu Picchu. This is one of the maps used by George Hunt Williamson during his exploration in Peru. This is the Black Notebook of George Hunt Williamson. Here's the same notebook, but opened. In this photo, you can see the wall with the petroglyphs of Pisharo. A page of the Black Notebook with some of the petroglyphs. Two clippings announcing a George Williamson lecture. From the end of July to the end of September 1958, he did a big lecture tour which began in Brazil, then brought him to Europe. In Spain, Italy, Germany, France, and finally England. In Mystical Journey, The Incredible Life of George Hunt Williamson, I dedicate 2 big chapters to this long lecture tour with totally new information concerning events in both Brazil and Italy. I have to indicate here the death of his wife, Betty Jane, which occurred during his tour in Europe on August 11th, 1958 in Lima, Peru, from the consequences of a crisis of rheumatic fever, a disease which afflicted her since childhood. This second life came to an end in 1961 in a kind of apotheosis by a last extensive journey in Japan for the promotion of the Japanese translation of Other Tongues, Other Flesh. From August 16th to September 25th, 1961, he was welcome in Japan as a prince by the ufologist Yusuke Matsumura and his organization, the CBA, the Cosmic Brotherhood Association. Williamson was shown Japan from north to south. Here's a photo of George Hunt Williamson in Japan. Here is another photo in Japan taken with Yusuke Matsumura, the leader of the CBA, the Cosmic Brotherhood Association. And there ended his second life to give way to the third life, which begins with a paradox, because in 1962, George Hunt Williamson is dead. Not physically dead, but he had proceeded, as I've already mentioned, to change his name. From then on, he was legally known as Michel Zirger. Regarding this aspect, which is highly unusual all in the same lifetime, I had the opportunity to acquire certain family documents which show that he changed name to resume that of his Serbian great-grandfather, who came in exile with his wife to the United States around 1860. Everything is explained in my book. Williamson's great-grandfather was a prince of royal blood, heir of the throne of Serbia, and thus Williamson, or rather Michel Zirger, could have actually aspired to the throne of Serbia had the opportunity come up. Here's the front page of the notarized affidavit signed by his mother, Bernice Elaine Hunt Williamson, on September 23, 1959, attesting the links to the Serbian Dobrinovic family and to the royal descent of George Hunt Williamson. Here is an illustration edited by myself showing two Dobrinovics. Left, Prince Milos Dobrinovic, 1780 to 1860, sovereign of Serbia, and ancestor of Michel Dobrinovic, George Hunt Williamson, on the right. In 1971, as surprising as it may sound, he is ordained a priest in an order affiliated to the Orthodox Christian Church, and in 1974 he is consecrated bishop. This does not prevent him from remarrying in 1973, on June 30th, to a rather famous former star of Western movies, a cowboy heroine, Jennifer Holt. From then on, his life evolved somewhat in the closed environment of the Hollywood cinema. They lived in a chic area of Santa Barbara, California. Among his Hollywood friends, we find, for example, Jane Russell. As a matter of fact, it was George Hunt Williamson, or we should say Michel Dobrinovic, who, as priest, officiated at the wedding of the actress to her third husband in 1974 in Santa Barbara. Here is George Hunt Williamson, as priest, with his wife, the Western movie star Jennifer Holt. Let us indicate that in 1978, Michel and Jennifer went their separate ways and that the divorce was pronounced on June 21st, 1979. Here's a photo of George Hunt Williamson with Thelma Dunlap, the friend who hosted him at the end of his life. His health deteriorates. He is sick from heart issues and had a first almost fatal heart attack in 1975. The last 8 years of his life he spent in seclusion as a recluse, accommodated by a friend, Thelma Dunlap, who lived in Long Beach, California. He worked on several projects, which unfortunately would never see the light of day. He died on January 25, 1986, from a fourth heart attack. He died relatively young, since he was still on the right side of 60. The exact date of his death, on January 25th, was still unknown just a few months ago. I was able to clarify this point thanks to the research I did jointly with an American friend and researcher, Vance Pollock. That just shows the investigative work I had to do, which can be compared to that of CSI. Such details as the exact date of his death had remained unknown until very recently. In fact, almost everything had to be done, and I would say that 80% of the information presented in my book is new and directly stemming from my own research. Another discovery I made recently, actually a byproduct of the research on his death, is that Williamson rests, well, his ashes, because he was cremated, in the National Cemetery of Arlington, which, as you may know, adjoins the Pentagon. Williamson thus rests literally under the windows of the Pentagon. On the left is the photo of the columbarium where his ashes rest. At the center, the map of the Arlington Cemetery. And on the right, another grave that you certainly know of, and which is also in the cemetery at Arlington. It is that of George Adamski. Williamson and Adamski are thus 100 meters away from each other. This also was unknown until a few months ago. Not the fact that Adamski is buried at Arlington, this was known, but the fact that Adamski and Williamson are in the same cemetery. It was unknown until 2012. Well, we have broadly seen the main sequences of the three lives of George Hunt Williamson. What I wanted to show also through this quick overview is how much George Hunt Williamson had been a precursor, a pioneer. He really deserves these titles of precursor or pioneer because, as we have seen, he witnessed the first meeting with an extraterrestrial. He was the first one to decipher a message left by an extraterrestrial. He was the first one to write a book on extraterrestrial contact by radio. He was the first one to conceptualize the theory of the ancient astronauts. He was the first one to link Peru and extraterrestrials. He was the first one to popularize the lines of Nazca in a book. He was the first one to link the legends of the North American Indian tribes with UFOs. And to finish on a Japanese note, he was the first to make a link between the Dogu figurines and extraterrestrial visitors of the past. So there you have it. I hope you learned a few things which will inspire you to read the book, Mystical Journey, The Incredible Life of George Hunt Williamson, from the publishing house Verdicciaro Edizioni. Thanks for listening.